Hi BookTube, I'm here with my May wrap-up. So I finished 26 books, so it's going to be a long wrap-up, I apologize. I DNF'd 2 books and I'll be carrying 2 more over into June. The longest book I read was only 254 pages, so that's why I was able to read 26 books. The shortest book I read was 32 pages. All the others were somewhere between 50 to 200 pages. And I read 2,942 pages altogether with an average rating of 3.5. So I DNF'd And Every Day the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer by Frederick Bachman because it was too saccharine, it was too sweet. As someone who actually works with people who have dementia, that's not what it's like. But I can tell it would be soothing to someone who's going through this for the first time, maybe? Yeah. And then I DNF'd The End of Religion by Bruxy Cavey. I had an inkling he was a little too cocky, felt like he wanted to set up his own cult, and I looked up his church, and they're homophobic, but they try to hide it. They call themselves a third way church, which means that they love and support gay people, but sex is only for marriage, and marriage is only between a man and a woman. So it's complicated homophobia, but it's homophobia still the same. So I threw the book in the recycling bin. Let's get on to the books I actually finished. So I listened to 7 audiobooks. I went through and I looked through the shortest ones I had. I don't have the time length here, but yeah. So Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Menen. So this is talking about going beyond the gender binary and being not just transgender, but also non-binary and all those other different gender fluidity things, right? It's a mix of Alok's personal journey, their rebuttals to common arguments against gender nonconformity, and a celebration of gender diversity. I don't really need convincing on this front, but they had a lot of good points about gender fluidity being more acceptable when you're a child, and gender conformity is something that is learned. That was really interesting to think about. As well, learning about the disconnect between the body and the self when you can't physically showcase who you are, and the harm that can do both physically and mentally was also interesting to learn about. It's also less than 2 hours long. I think it's only 1 hour and 7 minutes, and it's really worth a listen. I also listened to Upright Woman Wanted by Sarah Galley. This is a Western, but it's set in the future. So yeah, it's a dystopian that is the wet dream of evangelicals, is how I described it. So we follow a woman who has run away from her strict town to go join a group of people called the Librarians. It's actually a group of mostly women and non-binary folk who bring approved materials from town to town and who aren't what they seem. It's best to go into this book not knowing much because it's really short, but it was an interesting little story for sure. Then I listened to a popular book here on BookTube, and that's Kim Jiyoung, Born 1982 by Cho Nam-ju. This is about a typical every woman in South Korea. Cho Nam-ju details the difficulties women face in Korean culture, from birth, abortions being performed based on the sex of the child, to childhood, following school dress codes, creepy adult men following you, to adulthood, getting a career, having a baby, getting married, and how those interlink, or not very well interlink. And it can definitely be extrapolated to other countries as well. This is not just an issue faced in South Korea. These issues are universal. And it's interesting because she backs up this fictional story with statistics. So it's like a good mix of fiction and nonfiction together. Next, I listened to At the Bottom of the River by Jamaica Kincaid. And this is a series of short stories that are beautiful, weird, and thought-provoking, beautifully written. It was almost like listening to poetry. It is definitely one of my favorite books of the month. I especially like the story of My Mother, which is, it stands out so much in my mind because of how weird it was. The imagery that was portrayed in it about this relationship between a mother and daughter, and the daughter tries to kill the mother, and the mother keeps growing, and I thought there were sea creatures at some point. And like, it took me on a journey, man, and it was really good. I highly suggest you at least read just that story. I also listened to The Jaguar Smile, A Nicaraguan Journey by Salman Rushdie. So this is a nonfiction about his trip to Nicaragua in 1986. After the Sandinista revolution ousted the Somoza dictatorship. Somoza was backed by America, and this was just before the Contra revolution, if you know anything about Nicaraguan history. Even American history, it's played a big part in there too. He asks a lot of good questions actually about how the Sandinista government is different from the Somoza government. Obviously, democracy, dictatorship stuff aside, and challenges a lot of the intellectuals at the time down there, things like censorship, but ultimately agreed that like the American-backed Somozas had to go. And I liked how he didn't pose himself as an expert on Nicaragua, because he's not, he's Indian. But he approached it as him being an outsider learning about Nicaragua. So that was a pretty cool way to like bring his reader into it, especially if the reader doesn't know much about Nicaragua too. Then I listened to this hilarious book called Tales of Fosterganj by Ruskin Bond. It's hilarious, short, but interconnected stories about a writer going on a retreat to a small Indian village and the village people that he meets there. That includes a baker with a dozen children, a sweet old Scottish con man, a thief trying to reform by catching lizards to sell their oil as an aphrodisiac, and a sinister young boy who's hiding a big secret. And even that sinister stuff was quite funny. It was literally laugh out loud hilarious. And I tried to explain the story and I was just like, no, you have to listen to it in order to get it. Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to reading more about Ruskin Bond. And lastly, I listened to Finna by Nino Cipri. This is about a grandmother who gets lost in a wormhole in an IKEA-like store, and Ava and Jules, an ex-couple, are tasked with traveling through alternate dimensions in search of her. Really, it sounds like a weird concept, but it really works well. It's a fun, quick read filled with lots of cool things like disparaging capitalism, large corporations, non-binary characters, elderly characters that still kick butt, and chairs that may or may not eat you if you sit on them. Very good story to listen to. Then we get into like the books I read with my eyes. I read 10 physical and 2 ebooks. I just kind of threw them all together in this section here. So I read The Labyrinth Archivist by Day Al-Mohammed, and this is about a blind woman who's trying to carry on her family legacy of working as an archivist in the Labyrinth. And the Labyrinth is this world where people can go out and explore, and it's like that. It's like a maze, and there's different worlds throughout it, and the adventurers come back and they tell their stories and map out their journey, and the archivists write this all down. Problem is, our main character, Azulia, is blind and she's unable to write and create maps. So she has her cousin working with her because Azulia is very good at language. Her cousin can write and draw maps and everything, and they work well together. But the head archivist, who's also her mother, says, no, archivists have to be able to work alone. And this is all the background to the story. The main driving point in the plot is Azulia's grandmother is killed and she has to solve the murder. It's really cool. It's really good. I'm excited to see more in this series because there's a hint at the end. We don't get to go into the labyrinth in this story. We're just following her in the main kind of section where the archive is. But there's a hint that she might be going off and exploring the world, so I'm really excited to see where this series goes. And it's also really cool because there's a lot of diversity in this book and a lot of disability representation. Like, our main character is blind. There's a guy who's an amputee, but he's got like a tentacle prosthesis. Then I read I Remain in Darkness by Annie Ernaux, and I'm not going to go on a tangent here like I did in my last video about it. It's the complete opposite level of enjoyment from The Labyrinth's Archivist. So this is nonfiction about Annie. I'm not going to call her Miss Ernaux because she doesn't deserve that level of respect. Annie, pitting her mother in a long-term care facility and watching as she gets abused and falls into dementia and refuses to do anything about it, despite having the capacity to, and then writing multiple books about this to lament her own experience and go, woe is me, and profit off of her mother's torture. So yeah, that's how I felt about it. Then I read Arroz con Leche / rice pudding by Jorge Argueta, and this is a children's cooking poem. It's written in both Spanish and English. I kind of got this to kind of challenge myself into seeing how much Spanish I remembered from high school. Yeah, it's been a long time, and I was actually surprised at how much I remembered. And you know, I couldn't cook the recipe from just the Spanish, but it was pretty cool to remind myself about certain Spanish words. Then I read There Exists an X, X is a Sandwich by Joel K. Johnson, and I picked this up because of the title a long time ago, and it's been sitting on my shelf, and I finally decided to get around to it. It's really short. So it's a philosophical treatise on sandwiches. What is and what is not a sandwich. It really made me think a lot about sandwiches, and it made me hungry. And because with certain allergies that I have, mainly gluten and corn, it's really difficult to make a good sandwich. So it made me also a little bit angry at the time too. Also, I learned that subs are not sandwiches, but cakes are sandwiches. And logical equations are really hard to understand if you aren't already versed in them. Yeah. Don't let that deter you from reading it. It's actually very understandable, aside from like the one page where he writes out a logical equation, and I'm just like, I don't get all the letters and the words and brackets and all this stuff, dude. I don't get it. I also read Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn, which is not as good as Gone Girl. You know, it's been a while since I've read Gone Girl, so take that with, you know, what you will. So this is about Camille, who is sent back to her hometown by the newspaper she works for after the murder of 2 young girls. And her family is seriously messed up. Yeah, it was a good thriller. It kept me guessing right up until the end, because I thought I had who the murderer was, but I totally didn't. The thing that really bugged me was that none of the characters seemed to be the age that she said they were. They were either acting like far too young for their age or far too old for their age. And it wasn't just one character who this was characterized like this. It was like all the characters. I was like, I can't pin down how old anyone is. And then she'll give you an actual age and you'll be like, oh, that person's only like that old? I thought they were much older. Or that person's actually that old? I thought they were much younger. So that was really weird and jarring. But yeah, I read it all one day, and that was the longest book at 254 pages. So, you know, that's what you get with a thriller. I also read On Me by Francine Cunningham, which is a book of poetry written by a white-passing urban Indigenous woman with mental health problems. And she's also grieving the loss of her mother. And a lot is going on, and it was so good and so well written, and it addresses a lot of issues. It addresses racism, Indigenous rights, mental health issues. She suffers from anxiety and bipolar disorder, PTSD, sexual assault, intergenerational trauma. Like, it covers a lot, but it was all very well done, and like I was taking like crazy. I was like, this is awesome, this is great. You know, I highly recommend this. And don't be deterred by the fact that there's like no punctuation in capitalism, because it's definitely not like that Insta rupee car poetry stuff. It's better. Okay, I also read The Dreaming Earth by John Brenner. So this is set on an overpopulated Earth. There's a new drug making the rounds, with the ultimate consequence being the seeming disappearance of users from the face of the Earth. And we follow this government agent as he's investigating this. It's a very trippy 1960s science fiction. I always enjoy John Brenner's imagination and the way he looks at things, his commentary on social issues, and he really seemed like ahead of the time. Like, he's talking about climate change and like drug use and sexism and ableism and all this stuff in like the 1960s and 70s. So like, these issues are not new, but the way he addresses them make it still relevant to these days, which is kind of sad when you think about it. I also read Weep Not Child by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and this is about the lead up to the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, and that was unsettlement among the black population against the white settlers and the white government. We follow a young boy as he fulfills his dream of going to school among all this unsettlement going on. It seemed like a really simple story on the surface, because we are following this young boy, but if you look closer at the way he thinks, the words that he uses, you know, the intricacies woven into the different characters and their feelings and their thoughts, you see that it is a much more complicated book than you think it is. So yeah, it's definitely a good read. Definitely worth a reread, actually, at some point. I also read Hardboiled and Hard Luck by Banana Yoshimoto, and I can't believe it's taken me this long to get to her writing. Oh my gosh, I love it. These are 2 separate stories. Hardboiled is about a young woman going on vacation after the death of her partner, and she ends up getting visited by ghosts at this inn. And then Hard Luck is about a woman grieving as her sister slowly dies of a brain hemorrhage. Yeah, these stories are so wonderfully told, and even though I'm totally freaked out by ghosts and like it was pulling some typical kind of horror stuff, the first story, you know, it was still so touching that I didn't even get scared. I didn't think about the ghosts. I was thinking more about the characters, and I thought that was beautifully done. And I'll definitely be picking up more by her. I read another book of poetry called About Face by Jamie Hamilton, a collection of poems written in 1973 that I found at a free little library, and I had to add the entry onto Goodreads. I was, I guess, the first person on Goodreads to read it, and there's nothing really special about it. It's a book of poetry. It's nothing It was okay, but nothing stands out. Then I read The Tao of Pooh by Benjamin Hoff. I thought this would be like a cute little introduction to Taoism, but I felt like it was more like negative and critical of everything that wasn't Taoism, and ultimately thought it wasn't really actually a good introduction. I kept reading it because I just kept thinking, you know, I'll learn something from it at least. And I think I did. But you know, you can describe things without, you know, bashing and pitting other things down, and I don't think that's very Taoist to do. Hoff doesn't seem to like the other Pooh characters, and was particularly hard on Eeyore, which upset me because Eeyore is one of my favorite characters. He's against intellectuals, people who work, and seemingly against people who care too. So I don't know. I think I need to go and look at Taoism differently, because this would have actually turned me off if I didn't, you know that there is more out there. The last physical, actually this was an ebook, thing that I read, novel-wise, is How to Be Sick, a Buddhist-inspired guide for the chronically ill and their caregivers by Toni Bernhard. This was a really interesting approach to dealing with illness, because she's not offering cures or treatments, but different ways to think about pain and suffering. I really learned a lot about Buddhism through this as well, and while I didn't agree with everything she said, and I don't think that her way is achievable by everyone with a chronic illness, there's definitely some techniques for reframing how to think about illness and suffering that I've taken from this, and even just tips that I can apply to my healthy day-to-day life as well. And then I read a lot of comics. Saving time, and to be honest, because I've spent far too much time editing this video already, I'm just going to blast through these comics. If you want to know more, ask about them in the comments. I read Scene, Rachel Carson. I read Dumped by Andy Watson. I read Hadra by Jesse Lonergan. You can skip that one. I also read Tintin and the Broken Ear. I read Aggretsuko Meet Her Friends, Aggretsuko Meet Her World. Those are very cute. Check those out, definitely. And the last comic I read was Fables Volume 17, which was awesome. It's about trying to get the Fables together and creating a super team, and lots of references to X-Men, and I'm really looking forward to the next volume there. Okay, comics over, wrap up just about over. Okay. Then there were 2 books that I'm going to continue on into June. So I tired myself out on short books. Like the last week of May, I was just like, I don't want to read any more of these other books that I had on the TBR. I was just like, I'm done. I need something with more pages in it right now. So I picked up 2 books, and one of them is an audiobook called A Man by Kiichiro Hirano. And this is a Japanese detective is called to investigate after Ria's husband dies, and it is revealed he's not who he claimed to be throughout his whole life. So that sounded really cool. That's about 20 hours as opposed to the longest audiobook I listened to was only 5 hours. And then I also picked up A Discovery of Witches. I was craving fantasy and nothing too complicated, and I guess this just called to me. Seems like something I normally wouldn't pick up, but yeah. I'm calling it right now Twilight for adults, set in Oxford University. So it's like a reluctant witch, meaning that she is a witch, but she doesn't want to use her powers. Well, the vampire actually falls in love with her. I don't know if she's in love with him at this point. I'm only 120 pages in at this point, but if this was another book, it would have been done already and over with, and I would have known. But anyways, yeah, so it's a reluctant witch and an overprotective vampire, and they fall in love. So I want to talk a bit about my goals and some stats here. So I read 9 BIPOC authors, which was 35% of my writing, which is way more than I have been doing, so I'm very happy with that number. I read 9 female authors. I wanted 40% of my reading to be female authors, and this was only 35%. But I read 4 non-binary authors, which is 15%. So that means I only read 50% male authors. So I'm actually quite happy with only 35% female authors, and then having the rest of that chunk taken up by non-binary authors. I thought that was pretty cool. I read 7 books with LGBTQ+ rep, and 5 of those were own voices. I read 5 books that had disability rep, and 2 of those were own voices. I read 9 works of nonfiction, including 2 works of based on religion, and I wanted to read at least 1 nonfiction that wasn't religion. And I read from 9 other countries besides US, Canada, and the UK, which is 35% of my reading, and I wanted over 25%, so I blew that out of the water too. Trick to reaching all my goals is to read over 30 books a month. That's not achievable for me. Usually it's just that all these books were really short, and I was in a really good reading mood until the last 2 weeks. But I'm back into it now. I think it was just because all the books were so short. So thank you for sticking around while I blaze through all those 26 books. If you have more questions about them, definitely ask about them in the comments down below. And let me know what you read in May, and thank you for watching.